Working class jobs that have very few promotional prospects and less salary increments encourage the working class to have values such as immediate gratification, whereas middle class jobs, which have more promotional prospects and more likely to have salary increments, mean that the middle class are more likely to put off pleasures and plan for the future because they know that they're going to be in that job for a long time and they feel secure in that. By contrast, the middle classes have values of deferred gratification and future time orientation, which means that they're more likely to stay at university and don't leave education at age 16 to pursue jobs. So finally, when looking at cultural deprivation, we're just going to go back to educational policy. So compensatory education was created because it was believed that the working classes were culturally deprived. So compensatory education aims to compensate for the inequalities that the working class experience at home. So such policies which tackle cultural deprivation are Operation Head Start, which is actually American, and part of Operation Head Start involved Sesame Street, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, because Sesame Street was an educational program that people would watch, and therefore the poorest pupils could get a head start in education before they went to school. Sure Start was a program that was focused on, again, poor families, perhaps single parent families. Some of the things that Sure Start created were, which offered a range of services such as free childcare, drop-in activity sessions for children such as stay and play sessions, family support including support and advice on parenting, information about services available in the area, and information and guidance on breastfeeding, health and nutrition. There were also links with the job centre to encourage employment. And finally, education action zones, which were set up in poor, deprived areas, and within education action zones there were extra funding available for those schools. Funding was used to support the working classes through things like homework clubs and breakfast clubs. So cultural deprivation has been widely criticised because it blames the working class for their situation. And Nell Kelly argues that cultural deprivation is actually a myth. It blames the victim rather than the educational system or society itself. So it places the emphasis on the working class, not the fact that schools do not cater for the working classes, or the fact that as a result of living in a capitalist society, the working classes experience poverty. She argues that it's not possible for a child to be deprived of their own culture, and she argues that the working class are actually culturally different, not deprived. Even though Basil Bernstein, for the purpose of a sociological essay on this, he would fit into the functionalist view, people have argued that he's actually not a cultural deprivation theorist. Basil Bernstein argued himself that he was not blaming the working class for the inequalities, but that he was actually blaming the school. It's not because the working class have a restricted speech code that they fail. It's because the school does not teach them the necessary language skills that's needed for success, so the school does not successfully teach them the elaborated speech code. Troiner and Williams argue, similar to what we were saying about Bernstein, is that the problem's not the child's language, but is actually the school's attitude towards the language. So schools and teachers have a speech hierarchy, so they favour the speech of the middle classes and white pupils over black pupils and working class pupils, and as a result a self-fulfilling prophecy occurs where the working classes and black students feel that they are inferior. and their language is not credited. And then finally, Blackstone and Mortimer. Blackstone and Mortimer argue that the working classes attend fewer parents' evenings, not because they lack interest, but because they work longer hours or less regular hours and are put off by the school's middle-class atmosphere. They may want to help their child progress, but they may lack the knowledge and education to do so. For example, middle-class parents are perhaps more likely to complain because they understand the processes that take place in the education system, and they're more able to put across their point of view to teachers. There is also evidence that schools with mainly working class pupils have less effective systems of parent-school contacts, and this makes it harder for parents to keep in touch about their children's progress. So to sum up Blackstone and Mortimer, they argue really that the middle classes have more cultural capital and therefore are able to deal with the middle class atmosphere of a school, whereas the working classes lack that cultural capital. Those who criticise cultural deprivation argue that cultural deprivation theorists conceal the real causes of underachievement, which is basically social inequality and poverty. And they argue that the real problem is not cultural deprivation, but poverty and material deprivation. And in fact, poverty can lead to different values. So cultural deprivation may actually stem from poverty. And this can be seen with immediate gratification. Perhaps the working class hold values of immediate gratification because they don't actually feel that they have any choice but to leave school at 16 because they need the material benefit gained from that. Those who criticise cultural deprivation theorists or functionalists argue that working class culture is seen as deficient, but this is not true. Schools should actually recognise and build on the working class culture's strengths and should challenge teachers' anti-working classes prejudices. So finally, we're going to look at cultural capital. And as explained before, there's a difference between cultural factors and cultural deprivation, and cultural capital does not argue that the working class culture is deficient in some way. So we should be already aware of Borges' three main ideas. And he argues that the middle classes have more cultural capital, that's possession of the culture which is seen as desirable. And to give examples, we're talking about things like they're more likely to take their children on educational trips, perhaps to museums, or more likely to take their children abroad to gain cultural experiences abroad, such as going to Rome or Paris. And they're also more likely to perhaps give their children the more desirable books, more likely to introduce their children to opera, theatre, and perhaps books with high cultural capital such as Shakespeare. Middle classes also have more economic capital, which is basically money, and more social capital, which is connections, and connections can help the middle classes with education in that they have connections to teachers at school, but it can also help them with jobs in the future because they make the right connections for their children. So the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, is often heard in terms of things like children who want to be solicitors and so on. So cultural capital can lead to more educational capital, because if you've already got cultural capital, you've got a head start in the education system. Cultural capital refers to the knowledge, attitudes, values, language, tastes, and abilities of the middle class. Like wealth, it gives advantages to the middle classes. So the middle class acquire the ability to grasp, analyse and express abstract ideas through socialisation and the acquisition of cultural capital. They're more likely to develop intellectual interests and an understanding of what the education system requires for success. So in that way, they're starting the education system at the age of 5, ahead of the working classes. In schools, the middle classes' abilities and interests are highly valued, and as a result, they're rewarded with qualifications, which is educational capital. Borges is not a cultural deprivation theorist, because he argues that the reasons why the middle classes are rewarded with educational capital is because the education system isn't neutral, but it favours and transmits the dominant middle class culture. The textbooks depend on cultural capital. The middle class teachers have cultural capital, and as a result, middle classes feel more comfortable in the school environment. And by contrast, the working class children find that the school devalues their culture as rough and inferior. Their lack of cultural capital leads to exam failure, so they do not gain educational capital. Many working class pupils also get the message that education is not meant for them and respond by truanting, leaving early, or just not trying. So once we have educational capital, that then can be converted into economic capital, which is wealth. So as we can see from the diagram on the left, cultural capital can be converted to educational capital, which is then converted to economic capital. But it doesn't actually always have to work in that way. We might start off with economic capital, which is money, be able to buy into a private education, which is converted into educational capital, qualifications, which is then converted into cultural capital. In a top private school as well, there is an emphasis on cultural capital. So perhaps the working class who have managed to acquire wealth could send their child to a private school and gain more cultural capital through the private school system. So finally, we're just going to look at Alice Sullivan. She has done an empirical test to look at whether Bourdieu's theory is still relevant to today. So she looked at cultural capital in 2001, and the method that she used was she conducted questionnaires to 465 pupils in 4 schools. And the first thing that she had to do is she had to operationalise the concept, which means that she had to define it. She had to operationalise the concept of cultural capital. So she had to decide what she meant by cultural capital. So the measures that she used were things such as reading, TV habits, visits to art galleries and museums and theatres. And she found that those who read complex fiction and watched serious TV documentaries developed a wider vocabulary and greater cultural knowledge, indicating greater cultural capital. The pupils with the greatest cultural capital were children of graduates. These pupils were more likely to be successful at GCSE. But an interesting point that she found is when she compared working class children and middle class children with the same amounts of cultural capital, the middle class children still did better. So she concluded that cultural capital could only be a part of the explanation, and that actually material factors must play a part, as well as the greater parental expectations of the middle classes. So just to conclude then, in an essay you may be required to contrast material factors with cultural deprivation, or cultural deprivation with cultural capital. And really we cannot look at them as isolated factors, because material factors shape cultural factors. Poverty plays a part in affecting and creating the values of the working classes, and that's a key thing to remember in terms of your evaluation. Also, we cannot forget factors in the school. So although Bourdieu talks about cultural capital that is created in the home, he also blames the school for not transmitting the cultural capital, or not teaching the working class the cultural capital, and for transmitting the dominant ideology in the school. Also, don't forget that Bourdieu is a Marxist, so if you get a question about Marxism, that means that you can also now include Bourdieu.